Hey crafties, this is your guide to playing Simic in Standard 2022. Now, I know I've become kind of known for playing this deck, and I have my own build of it, which I will talk about a little bit later. But the first thing that I wanted to do with this video was to just go over the archetype and to talk about all of the different options that you can have for building this archetype. And I think that will really help you to get a sense of what's possible and to hopefully inform your decisions when you yourself are building the deck. And then I'll talk, you'll get to hear my opinions about the choices that I have made so that when we actually look at my deck, it'll all make a little bit more sense. So let's start with the overall plan. Simic, Simic in this format is all about generating more mana and then playing your heavy hitters in the late game. Your heavy hitters in this archetype are basically 3 7-drops. We've got Coma, Cosmos, Serpent. Everyone knows how I feel about this card, but it's done a lot of work for me in this format. We've also got Cyclone Summoner, which is just an easy way to reset the board, especially against creature matchups. It can also sometimes help us buy back some of our value creatures like Quandrix's Cultivator. And then finally, Alrund's Epiphany. We all know how good this card is. Just take extra turns. So the whole deck is designed to just get us to a place where we can actually play these cards and then usually just lean on them to win. One of the cool things about Simic is that it just plays bigger and badder spells than most of the other decks in the format. And so that's something that we get to exploit by playing this list. It's also just so much fun to put more lands on the battlefield. If you're the kind of person who likes watching your land count shoot up, if you're the kind of person who likes having 6 lands when your opponent has 2 or 3, then this is definitely the deck for you. Okay, so let's talk about our ramp options. How do we actually get there, right? Just to be clear, if you're playing Simic in this format, these 3 cards should all be in your deck, in my opinion, in some measure. Even if you're playing like a Druid class version, which we'll talk about later, you should still be putting cards like these in your deck because they're just basically the best thing to be doing. I haven't seen a cogent plan that doesn't involve those cards that I think is better. And I'm definitely I'm not an advocate of these Kraken lists either, the Snow Kraken. Let's just look that card up real quick. So I've seen some people build lists around Icebreaker Kraken that involve returning lands back to their hand and then playing them out again. I think that this is mostly a meme. So if you think otherwise, prove me wrong. But in the meantime, I'm just going to suggest that you stay away from Icebreaker Kraken lists if you're actually trying to win. If you want to have fun, sure, build the list and see how it does. Okay, so let's talk about our ramp options and what they do for us. A lot of people have criticized my use of Neverwinter Dryad in the deck, and I agree the creature looks kind of mopey. It has a number of downsides, so people wonder why is this my 2-mana ramp of choice. I just remembered I need to add another what? I spell it wrong. Okay. Sure, I just need to add Innkeeper to the list. Okay, so people wonder why I run Neverwinter Dryad, right? It's a 1/1, it dies so easily. It's kind of mopey. You have to spend 3 mana to get your money to get out of the ramp. So why would you not try one of these other options over here? So there's a few things that I really like about Neverwinter Dryad. The first thing about this card is that it comes down on turn 1, and your opponent has precisely 1 turn to deal with it. And that is harder than you might think in this format. Now, there are a number of decks that can do that. So, for example, Dragons can easily kill this even if you're on the play with Frostbite. And then if you're on the draw, of course, there are a number of decks that can run removal, which will kill this on their turn 2 after your turn 1. I personally don't worry about that particular scenario because the rest of our turn 2 ramp options, except for the Innkeeper, all suffer from that problem as well. So It's just as easy to kill any of the rest of this stuff as it is to kill this if it's your opponent's turn 2, right? I think Portable Hole and Frostbite are the only 2 cards in the format that really deal with this efficiently. Even if they have them, like in the case of mono, like Frostbite feels bad, but mono white, it just means they're not playing a 1-drop to attack you with on turn 1, so it's not even necessarily the end of the world. So if they don't kill it on your turn 1, basically as soon as you play your second mana, this card is live to ramp you. And once it does ramp you, you get your land and you keep your land. The only way that someone can get rid of your land after you ramp with Neverwinter Dryad is by actually stone raining it. And there's basically no cards in the format that do that. So one of my favorite things about Neverwinter Dryad is you get your money. Once you hit the ramp, you get the land, you keep the land, you're good to go. Now, obviously, it only gets forest, so it's a bit of a downside. Personally, I feel like if you build your mana base right, that's almost never a problem, but it should be mentioned. Some of these other cards have more versatility. But overall, I have found Neverwinter Dryad to be very reliable. Another nice thing about Neverwinter Dryad is that you can chump block with it and sack it to still get your land. This comes up a lot, like against any aggressive matchup on turn 2. You'll untap with your 2 lands, you'll say go, your opponent will tack into it, you get a free block, basically, which I really like. So a lot of the rest of these, you're really not going to want to block with them, right? So let's talk about that. Emergent Sequence. This is probably the second choice that I would recommend. If you don't want to play Neverwinter Dryad, I would recommend you first try Emergent Sequence. This card is very cool, and it's very good. And one of the nice things about it is that it can get you a blue mana if you're needing blue mana. Again, like I said, it doesn't come up that often, but it does come up. So why don't I like Emergent Sequence? The reason I don't like Emergent Sequence is that the land you create is a creature, and it can just be removed so easily. And one of the things I want to highlight is that if you spend 1 mana and play this on turn 1, and your opponent kills it, it's like mana parity, right? You haven't invested that much in it. They had to invest an equal amount of mana. They also lose a card to kill it. So it's just kind of not that big of a deal. But to spend your turn 2, to spend 2 mana on one of these and then to have it get killed, like that's a fairly nasty tempo loss. Especially if your opponent's able to do something like, if they're able to only spend 1 mana on their Frostbite to kill it, or, you're pretty much at danger of like a Prismari command playing any of these cards. And they really own you, right? So that really sets you back, and it also puts your opponent far ahead. They can like make a treasure. So they can basically, not only can they time walk you, kill one of your lands, but they can also walk another turn forward by making themselves a treasure. So if they get to do that, that's pretty much GG in my opinion. Another thing to note about Emergent Sequence is that the land often comes in as a 2/2 because you make a land drop before you play it often, but sometimes it doesn't, right? And so if this comes in as a 1/1, then it's just embarrassing. It dies really easily to like any like 1 ping damage effect. It dies to the Ghast, right? It dies to Shambling Ghast, which is just a total disaster. So on the whole, the fact that Emergent Sequence always makes the land a creature, and then the fact that it stays, you never don't get a creature land out of this, right? So then if your opponent's playing something like a Blood on the Snow, for example, let's say you've cast 2 Emergent Sequences in the early turns of the game, your opponent hits a Blood on the Snow, all of a sudden that's like two of your lands dead, right? So that's a really, really bad combo. It lines up very, very poorly. So because cards like that, or cards like even like Verdict, right? Shadow's Verdict is another thing that can kill your lands. So I just really think that it's too weak. Even allowing your opponent to do something like, in your mono green matchup, right? They can just untap and just use a Blizzard's Brawl and kill the land that you made. And that's such a hit. It's such a hit in your tempo, and your opponent does that. So that applies to not only to Emergent Sequence, but Lotus Cobra and Sculptor of Winter both suffer from that. All 3 of these cards basically suffer from the same issues in various ways. Lotus Cobra in particular, I don't like. I think a lot of people know that I'm really not a fan of this card in any deck except like a really combo-y deck, such as the Omnath decks of yesteryear. But just as like a normal mana dork, I'm not a fan of this. And even if you're doing stuff like, you can, like, I'll show you Aintrazi's deck a little later. He built a deck where it combines Lotus Cobra and Emergent Sequence and Vastwood Surge, stuff like that, so that you can generate a lot of mana from Lotus Cobra. It's cute, and I think that you can have some very explosive games and turns with it, but sometimes you just don't get your money at all off of Lotus Cobra, right? And this doesn't give you any mana if you're not making land drops. So if you're in a situation where like you desperately need to make more mana in the early turns to cast your Field Trip or any of your other ramp spells, you can really get caught out with Lotus Cobra. And again, Cobra dying to Shambling Ghast is just such an embarrassment. I think that alone is a reason to not play it. So let's talk about Sculptor of Winter. This card basically suffers from the same weaknesses as the rest of these cards. One nice thing is that this can actually untap for you any color of mana that you have. So that's a kind of a plus and a minus. If, like, let's say that you're needing blue mana, Sculptor of Winter is not going to help you, right? Because you actually need to have the land out to get that benefit. So it's like Neverwinter Dryad in that way. It can only make green mana for you unless you've managed to find yourself a blue land. So Lotus Cobra is nice because it can actually... Lotus Cobra and Emergent Sequence are the only two. I guess Innkeeper does as well, but these are the two that get you like a... Yeah, okay. So Innkeeper as well, that allow you to get blue mana. So let's talk about Prosperous Innkeeper. This card is fantastic. I think it has proved itself to just be a generally good card. You see it in all kinds of decks, and it's certainly fantastic in my deck. I definitely play 4 of these, and I would not cut them for anything else. So there's a few things that are great about Prosperous Innkeeper. The best thing about Prosperous Innkeeper is that you always get your money, all right? So unless your opponent is like making some awful janky play, like destroying your treasure, spending mana and cards trying to destroy your treasure, which is good for you, right? Because they're just making terrible plays in that case. So unless they're trying to do that, you will always get your money's worth on this card. Now, one of the problems is it's a single use, right? So it's not, excuse me, it's not like actually permanently advancing your ramp plan. But we work around that by playing really good cards at 4, which you're just very heavily incentivized to do in this format. So I think overall it's worth it. Another thing to note about the Innkeeper is that it gains you an important amount of life over the course of the game. You can do stuff like get extra life from Alrund's Epiphany, any of like random Quandrix Cultivators that you might play. And then if you're doing like a Seeker's Chariot stuff, that's another way to gain a surprising amount of life. And then of course the combination of Coma and Prosperous Innkeeper is, you're gaining a life every turn. And then if you have multiple Innkeepers, it's just nasty. But that's usually just game over against any aggro deck or any deck trying to kill you with damage. So for the reasons I've outlined here, my cheap ramp of choice that I use is Neverwinter Dryad and Prosperous Innkeeper. And it's simply because I find that these are the 2 cards that most reliably give me mana, which sticks around until I want to use it. And it's hard to disrupt. It's just a lot harder to disrupt someone ramping with either of these than it is to ramp with any of these, right? So that's what it comes down to. I want my ramp to be as reliable as possible. All right, let's talk about Field Trip. So Field Trip is a card that I've been pretty down on for Constructed. I've never really liked this card that much. Having said that, I do think it has a place in the format, and for me, the place in the format to run Field Trip is when your deck is running 5 cost cards that you want to hit early. For that reason, I think it works very well in Golgari, because Golgari has a number of black cards that are really good to hit on 5. The first being Lolth. Lolth is a fantastic Planeswalker. Just one of the best cards in the format, and so hitting that early can be a real game changer. Also, there's Shadow's Verdict on 5, which is another card that can be really important to hit sooner rather than later. So for that reason, it's really a curve consideration. I honestly don't understand why you would run a card like Field Trip in your deck if you weren't trying to get to 5. The other curves that I think about, like playing this on turn 5 and then what, like you're casting your sciences as well the same turn, is just like, it's kind of underwhelming, you know? Now, obviously, in the late game, it gives you a learn, which is nice, which is a benefit over some of the other cards we're going to talk about. But I don't think it does enough in general. So yeah, I would only run Field Trip personally if I had some impactful 5s that I wanted to get out. There's no other argument that I can see that for me justifies running a card like this. Okay, let's go on to the 4s. I think that the best 4-mana ramp spell in Standard 2022 currently is Quandrix Cultivator. This card just does so much for you. So let's start off by, again, this is a card where if this resolves, you always get your money. You get a land, it's a real land, it's not a creature land, you get to keep it for the rest of the game. And it also comes in untapped. Now, these Simic decks don't play that many wands, although one of the reasons I do like Neverwinter Dryad is that you can have curves where you can play a Neverwinter Dryad off of a Quandrix Cultivator, and that's pretty nice. You don't always want to do it, but sometimes it comes up. But then the cool thing is, like, let's say that you have 5, you make your 5th land drop and then you play Quandrix Cultivator, and now you have 2 untapped mana on that turn. And that's huge, because then you can do something like Foretell Anularan's Epiphany, or you can play another Prosperous Innkeeper, or just another ramp spell of your choice. Or you can even do something like leave up interaction like Decisive Denial, which I personally have been really enjoying using in the format and think it's very good. So that making the untapped mana can just really give you a lot of options. You can even have turns where maybe on 6 mana you play this and now you can leave up your Divide by 0. So this card just gives you a lot of flexibility. And then the 3/4 body is not a joke, like mono white, for example, especially this brick walls their plan, basically. If they don't have apparition, or like sometimes Luminarch Aspirant can get their creatures around this, but it's a hassle. Like, this is a real hassle for them, especially if it comes down on turn 3. Multiple of these actually block very well, like double blocking with 3/4s is just a pretty solid way to stop bigger creatures. So anyway, and it's also a threat against more controlling decks. So there's just a lot of reasons why I think that this card is fantastic. Just another note as well, if you are playing Cyclone Summoner, then Quandrix Cultivator is a great card because you can actually get these bounce back to your hand and then you can keep ramping. So that's a really cool thing to note. Also, on that note, a thing that I forgot to mention that I don't like about specifically Lotus Cobra and Sculptor of Winter is that playing them in a deck with Cyclone Summoner feels really cringe to me. And that's because, maybe you're tapping these down or like generating mana to play down your Cyclone Summoner early. And then you bounce your Cobra and your Sculptor of Winter back to your hand. And now you've just de-ramped yourself, right? You might like only have 5 lands at that point or 6 lands. So to spend your next turn just playing your dorks out again is so embarrassing, in my opinion. So I think that these cards are just a mismatch in any deck running Cyclone Summoner, and I don't really understand why you would want to play them in that situation. Okay, let's talk about Vastwood Surge. This is a very strong ramp spell, so being able to just grab 2 lands and put them on the battlefield is really powerful. So I can see why someone might want to run Vastwood Surge, and I wouldn't blame someone for running like 1 or 2 copies of this. This is one of the only ways that I can think of for you to get a turn 4 coma, right? So you can do something like play Dryad on 1, ramp it on 2, play Vastwood Surge on 3, which gets you up to 6 mana, and then on the turn 4 you drop the 7th land from your hand and play a coma. So if you do decide to run Vastwood Surge, I would definitely make sure that you're running at least 3 copies of Coma in your deck. This is my personal opinion, is that I think that if you're going to run Vastwood Surge in your deck, you want to probably just max out on all of your 7s, right? Because so let's talk about the downside of Vastwood Surge, is that it doesn't draw you any cards, it doesn't do anything except make mana for you. And so if you draw this in the late game when you already have a lot of mana, it's just basically a dud. Now, people can say, yeah, well, what if you kick it, right? That buffs your team. But I just, like, for me personally, I find that to be extremely underwhelming. I find that the deck generally doesn't actually go that wide. And I do find that when the deck does go wide, it's often because you're playing cards like Coma, which really don't need the help. So, yeah, I think that like thinking that the kicker is going to win you a lot of games, I think is, yeah, I'm just not so into that. The combination with Alrund's Epiphany is probably the best argument for it, but I find that it doesn't come up that often. And even if it does, there's just so many sweepers and stuff in the format. So it's fine, but I don't think it's enough. Like, I don't think that the kicker justifies it, in this deck, especially. We're not really going that wide. It just ends up being not that impressive a lot of the time. So, but one of the reasons to run a card like this is that it does reliably get you to your sevens earlier in the game. So I think if you're going to run Vastwood Surge, you need to just max out on your top end, and your plan just needs to be ramp as quickly as possible, right? And that's a fine plan. That's a totally fine plan to do it that way. So I wouldn't blame anyone for running one or two of these. I think they're fine. I don't, though. So the card that I choose to run instead is Eureka Moment. Now, a lot of people have given me trouble for running this card. They think it's worse than the alternatives. They think it's not a very good card. So why do I like this card? I like this card because it's versatile, and I like this card because it solves a number of problems of the deck. So with this deck, we want to be on plan. We want to be ramping. We want basically most, if not all, of our non-payoff cards to be ramp cards. But the wonderful thing about this card is that this does help us to continue our ramp plan. Like on turn 4, we can play this, and it is progressing our game plan forward while also drawing cards, right? So one of the problems that Simic decks and ramp decks in general often run into is that, if half of your deck is dorks, you play your hand out very quickly, you play your ramp cards out very quickly, all you're left with after that is usually lands, right? And then, you play however many top end cards that you've drawn, and then oftentimes what will happen is that you just play out your hand really quickly, and then you have all of these lands and nothing to do with them, and you're just drawing off the top of your library hoping to hit your next Alrund's Epiphany. So to combat this, we definitely want to try to get some amount of card draw into the decks. And so one of the things that I personally like about Eureka Moment is that of all of these 3 cards here, this is the best one to draw in the late game, right? So if you've already done the ramping, you've already played a Coma or something, maybe your opponent deals with it, and you're in this late game scenario, you don't want to just be top decking, because then you're often just drawing a bunch of dorks and cards that don't really matter that much. So Eureka Moment in that situation gives us velocity. It keeps us churning through our deck. It keeps us drawing cards. And I really like it for that. So drawing like a late game Quandrix Cultivator is often not that good. And in many board states, a late game Vastwood Surge is not that good either. So I think that this card is the clear winner in the late game. And I think it's totally fine in the early to the mid game as well. So I just don't see this as big of a downside as a lot of people seem to think it is. And I think the upside is high enough. So let's talk about another option that some people have used in these decks is Glimpse of the Cosmos. So let's talk about this card really quickly as an option. I have chosen to not put this card in my ramp decks. And the reason for it is just that for me, a 2-mana draw spell feels like a mismatch in our plan. It's not that it's bad, but I often find that we don't really have a good window to play it in the early game. We're usually trying to focus on getting down our Dryads, our Innkeepers, our Quandrix Cultivators, and just not dying to something like mono white or mono green, right? So I usually don't feel like I have the window to just spend 2 mana in the first 4 or 5 turns of the game to draw cards. And so I would definitely be skeptical of building your deck with a lot of these. 4 of them seems really aggressive to me. You're going to end up with these hands that are you'll have a Neverwinter Dryad or a couple ramp spells, a couple Glimpse the Cosmos, and then you'll be spending your key mid-game turns while your opponent is beating you down, just drawing cards and digging and digging. And a lot of the cards that you dig into are other cards like Vastwood Surge, which aren't going to save you the next turn, right? So I just think that it's hard in the early game to find the right window to play these cards. and they're not helping our plan. It's just a draw spell, right? So these cards are just really not very good in the early game in my experience, and I don't think that their quality in the late game is enough to justify putting them in the deck. So that's kind of my overview on that. But plenty of other people have decided this card is good enough for the matchup, and the ability to play this off of your animated Hall of Storm Giants, or off of Cyclone Summoner, or off of Faceless Haven is quite good. So, I can see why people would want to play it. I just personally don't. Okay. So I think that really covers like the ramp options and the payoff options. So let's just reiterate a little bit. I think that in my builds, I play 4 Alrund's Epiphany. I think that you never run less than 4 of this card. One of the reasons this card is so good in the deck is that sometimes you ramp pretty easily into 6 mana, and just having a ramp payoff that you can play at 6 mana instead of 7 mana can be really crucial. This can also get you an extra turn so that you can actually draw more cards and make another land drop to finally be able to play your Cyclone Summoner. So this card, in a sense, can be kind of like just playing your Summoner a turn early, effectively, is what it can end up being, or your Coma a turn early. So Alrund's Epiphany is an absolute 4 of. Like, this, if there's any of these top end cards that you're not sure like how to distribute your wild cards, make sure you have 4 Alrund's Epiphany. Next thing, Cyclone Summoner. I run 3 in my builds. A lot of people run 4. That's fine either way. I just found that I was drawing a lot of them. I was having too many of them in my opening hands. I don't have a problem usually finding them at 3. And in some matchups, they're just not good. Like against Blood Money, this card is mediocre or lukewarm. It can be powerful, but oftentimes it just dies to a Vanishing Verse and doesn't do that much. It bounces your opponent's board and they get to replay all their value creatures, so it's really not that great. It bounces their Kaya back to their hand and they just get to play it next turn. So, and against control decks, this is terrible. Now, control is not that big in the format, but like dragons, this card is really bad against Izzet dragons. So it's only good against like half of the decks in the format. And so personally, I just felt like that made it a 3 of and not a 4 of. I run 2 Coma in my deck. A lot of people like to run 3 or the full 4. Again, for me personally, I think if you run all 12 of these 7 drops, that's just like you're going to have a lot of 7 drops in your opening hands. You're going to draw a lot of 7 drops in the early game, and you have to be ready for that, right? So I just feel like you're going to have a lot of mulligans. It's going to increase the number of mulligans you're going to have to do. It's also going to increase the number of really dorky hands you have. Like, you keep a hand with 1 Coma and then you draw 2 more Comas, and it's going to feel really awkward. You're a lot more likely to just die from having a bad hand that doesn't do exactly what you want it to do at the state of the game that you're in if you're running so many 7 drops. So that's something to think about. It's one of the reasons I encourage you to run Vastwood Surge if you are running the full 12, because it just makes it a lot more likely that you're actually going to be able to cast them on time. So my split is I do 4 Alrund's Epiphany, 3 Cyclone Summoners, 2 Coma, and that is the configuration that I have found best, especially for best of 1. Okay, let's talk about the lands a little bit. I think Hall of the Storm Giants is a land you have to run in this archetype. We power out the lands really quickly, and this is a very potent threat. It's also a really good threat against the decks that are otherwise good against us. So like Blood Money, for example, Hall of the Storm Giants is a really key card to keep pressuring them, to keep making their removal bad, to make them have to leave up 4 mana to play Vanishing Verse. It just really is punishing for them. So, Hall of the Storm Giants is, in my opinion, one of the most, if not the most important creature lands in the deck. The version that I run is a snow version, and I run 2 copies of Faceless Haven. That's the amount that I have found to work into my particular mana base. Faceless Haven's obviously a fantastic card, so if you can work it into your version, I think it's good. The reason I don't run 4 is just that we really need to have like untapped green mana on turn 1, and when you run 4 Faceless Havens, you have a lot of opening hands where you have like 2 Havens and a Hall of the Storm Giants, and then you have green ramp in your hand. You can't cast it in the early game, so you have to mulligan that hand. I also run 4 copies of Vine Glimmer Snarl. Again, I think it's really, really crucial to have untapped land on turn 1 when you're playing Neverwinter Dryad. And so I run 4 of these. I find that if you sandbag a basic land in your hand to play out last, it really mitigates the downside of Vine Glimmer Snarl, which is that you draw them tapped in the late game. It's usually not a problem. It's only like on turn, maybe maybe on turn 6, you really need to draw an untapped land and you draw a Snarl. That can be a problem, but most of the time you get to work this into your curve in a way that makes sense. So some people playing the snow version of the deck will play Rimewood Falls. I think that that's a trap. I think that that's a mistake. I do not run this even in my snow version of the deck. Because I think that having an always tapped land that doesn't really do anything else for you is just too slow for the deck. So I choose not to run them. And for me, my decision is just that if I get to turn on my Faceless Haven, great. If I don't, that's fine. It's still producing me mana. So I don't think of it as I must get this online. I more think of Faceless Haven as if I end up with the snowlands, great. And you usually do, right? Because with Neverwinter Dryad and Quandrix Cultivator, you're actually fetching up snowlands. So they really help to kind of buffer the count, even if you're running 4 Vine Glimmer Snarls and 4 Pathways as well. Let's get the Pathway in here. So I definitely run... I definitely run Bark Channel / Tide Channel Pathway. I run 4 of those in my list as well. I think that it's madness to not do that because we just need untapped dual lands, basically. So, I just recommend everyone, this is my personal opinion, is that everyone playing the deck needs to be running 4 Snarls, 4 Bark Channel Pathways, no Rimewood Falls, even if you're snow. And then... I think 1 copy of Quandrix Campus can be good if you find yourself in a lot of grindy games and you just want additional ways to spend your mana. I have in the past run this card. I don't currently run it, but I think it's totally fine. So if you want to throw one of those in there, that's fine. I probably wouldn't run any more than 1. Okay, now, so that's the core of the deck. We've got our ramp, we've got our payoffs, we've got our mana base. I run 26 lands in the deck. Plus, a couple DFCs in the form of like Glasspool Mimic, for example. I wouldn't go lower than that. If I did go lower than that, it would be maybe because I was running Emergent Sequence, and then I'd be running multiple of these and maybe 25 lands. But here's something that people forget is that in a ramp deck, you actually do need to draw lands to play them, right? So in addition to playing cards like Emergent Sequence that fetch us a land, Emergent Sequence doesn't do that much for us if we miss our land drop that turn, right? So I've seen some of these versions of this deck playing like 22 lands and a bunch of ramp, and they feel like they're kind of getting away with it because, they're fetching so many lands from the deck. But the problem is that decreases the likelihood that you're going to draw a lot of lands, which decreases the likelihood that you're going to actually make your normal from the hand land drop every turn. And that's a huge mistake, right? Because if you're doing a bunch of ramping, but you're actually technically missing land drops, then it's working backwards, right? So, yeah, I think that it's madness to play one of these decks with less than 25 lands, and I run 26 plus DFCs, like I said. Okay, let's move on to some of the other cards that you can consider playing in these archetypes. So one of them is Druid class. Personally, my opinion is that while Druid class decks might play a number of these other cards, and while the archetypes might end up looking somewhat similar, Druid class is a very different card with a very different plan, and it's not necessarily on the ramp plan. I think that we want to be spending our mana in the early turns generating more mana. I don't think that it really makes sense for us in a ramp deck like this to spend turn 2 playing the class and turn 3 activating it and then hopefully playing an extra land at that point, right? in the early turns of the game, it doesn't guarantee us making a bunch of extra land drops. So it doesn't fetch us lands, right? So like if you keep a 2-lander and you play Druid class, there's just no guarantee that you're going to get any amount of benefit from this. So I think that Druid class decks are just different decks. I wouldn't make like just some straight up Simic ramp deck and play Druid class as another ramp spell. I think that you need to build around Druid class and you need to make a bunch of different decisions to make this card good. So there are sweet Druid class decks. I've played them in the format. I've had, positive win rates in Mythic with Druid class decks. I just think that you need to take a whole different approach with them. Let's talk about Decisive Denial, which is actually one of my favorite cards in the format. I think that finding this card, or rather remembering that this card existed and adding it to my list, is one of the things that really took my deck to the next level. This card just does everything for you. So we have like good fight creatures in the form of Quandrix Cultivator, which can really slow down like a mono green opponent or a mono white opponent, any aggressive person who's trying to get ahead of you. So in creature matchups, it has a home. And then in matchups that aren't creature heavy, it also has a home because it counts as non-creature spells. And the tax of 3 is pretty significant. And one of the things that you have to remember is that Covertgoblue said this on the podcast, and it's totally true. A lot of the impactful spells in the format are actually really expensive. So like Alrund's Epiphany and Blood on the Snow, 2 excellent examples. Even cards like Lolth or Kaya, 5-mana Planeswalkers. And even if your opponent has a lot of treasure and stuff, like, who can afford to pay for an Alrund's Epiphany and then 3 on top of it? Like, that's very rare. So you actually get your money on Decisive Denial a lot. And it's really helpful at basically all points in the game in this format, with rare exceptions. So I run a couple of copies in my deck. I've been very happy with it. Most of the decks also run some number of Divide by Zero. I think this card is totally crucial. So let's talk about why. First of all, having access to a learn board is very, very important for this archetype. So let's talk about the kind of stuff that you might want to play. The first card that's really important is Teachings of the Archaics. This is a card I've just gotten higher and higher and higher on this card as I play this deck more. I run 2 in my sideboard currently because I think that's so important. So, like I said before, card draw is card advantage is one of the weaknesses of Simic at the moment, is that we don't have amazing cards like Hydroid Krasis or Uro, which just keep our hand full. So we actually have to work a little harder for it, and Teachings of the Archaics is one of the best ways to do that. You can often, this deck, like I said before, you often empty your hand, you make a land drop every turn, and then you're playing out your ramp. Your ramp makes more mana, which allows you to spend more spells from your hand every turn. And so what happens is that we frequently empty our hand faster than some of the slower decks in the format, such as maybe Dragons or Blood Money. So as a result of that, Teachings of the Archaics gets a lot better where, we're often live to draw 2, and then in some cases we actually do manage to draw 3. Another thing it should be noted is that if you drop a Cyclone Summoner, it's usually one of the last cards in your hand, and it usually fills your opponent's hand back up. So especially if they're like a mono white opponent, they may have dropped like 6 cards over the course of the game. They pick them all up with Cyclone Summoner, and now bam, your opponent suddenly has a full hand again, and you have an empty hand often. And so you can grab a Teachings, and even against a empty your hand deck like mono white, you can end up drawing 3 cards, which is really fantastic. So Teachings is a really amazingly important card in the archetype, and it's one of the big reasons to run Divide. Basic Conjuration is also great. I run one of these. I have been reaching for this more lately, and one of the reasons for that is that this just helps you dig for your impactful Cyclone Summoners and Comas. And so, there will be many times where I'll go many games without fetching and casting this card, but when you need it, you really need it, right? And so it's really great. Also, the gaining 3 life is important sometimes too. So remember that you have access to that. Sometimes you just need another turn, right? And you do the math and you realize, if I can just gain enough life, I'll survive until I can play my summoner, and then it's a totally different game. I do run one copy of Containment Breach. It's a really good card against all of the classes. There's just enough stuff going in the format. It can kill your opponent's Seeker's Chariot. It's just a good card. Definitely run one of them. And then I also run 2 Environmental Sciences. It's just obvious. This deck wants lands. Gaining the life is nice. And so, yeah, definitely run 2 of those. And then for me, I've only recently been running 1 Mascot Exhibition in my sideboard. I think that it's really tempting to get this because we're a ramp deck. We produce so much mana. It seems like an obvious fit to just like ramp and then slam a Mascot Exhibition. But unfortunately, it's just Mascot Exhibition isn't always that good. Like it can be really good against like mono white or mono green. It can kind of like shut the door against a deck like that. But against any deck running sweepers, basically, Mascot Exhibition can be really unimpactful, right? And so I've only been running 1, and I've been happy with that and prioritizing just drawing cards, digging to my good, cards. Because basically, the acknowledgement there is that like 1 coma is worth like several Mascot Exhibitions, right? Hitting 1 good, important creature that we really needed can be a lot more powerful than just kind of filling the board with a bunch of vanilla creatures. So that's my split. I currently run 2 teachings, 1 conjuration, 1 breach, 2 sciences, and 1 exhibition. Okay, so as a result of that, I think learning is very important. I play 4 Divide by Zeros, and I think for so many reasons, Divide by Zero is a really important card in the archetype. So for starters, it gives us something else to do on 3. It just fills out our curve. You'll notice that these decks, even if they're playing Field Trip, are light on 3s, and Divide by Zero just gives us something to do at the 3 mana slot, which is very impactful. It can really slow your opponent down. It can put a Spellbinder back in their hand, and then you can, fetch whatever lesson you need to keep advancing your game plan. In the late game, Divide by Zero is especially important because you can do stuff like your opponent goes for a Blood on the Snow and you just return it to their hand. Now you get an entire other turn with your board, which maybe has a giant and like some other stuff on it, right? So it can really slow down controlling decks. It can also stop your Izzet Dragon's opponent from taking another turn. And even in some edge cases when you have enough mana, like for example, so there have been games that I've won where I had a coma, and a divide in hand, and I've waited like 3 or 4 turns to just have enough mana that I could play coma and then leave up divide, and then you dodge your opponent's removal, play coma the next turn again, and that's often game over. So finally, you can do some fancy stuff like return Cyclone Summoner to your hand and then play it again to reset the board, which is really good. So in summary, I think Divide by Zero is a really great card in the archetype, and I always run 4. I would never cut 1. Okay, now let's talk about some of the optional cards. I do run a Seeker's Chariot in my list. I've been very impressed with this card. So this card shores up weaknesses for the deck, and it's why I like it. This card is very, very good against aggressive decks. It's really good against mono white in particular. Even if they have an apparition, it makes 2 blockers, which can really slow your opponent down. It can even be pretty good against mono green. It can just slow them down. One of the play patterns that I like with this card is that you play it, you make the cats, and then you either trade with the cats or chump block with the cats in combat. And then later when you drop your summoner, you get your chariot back, and then you can play it again and you get more value out of it. So that's a thing that I really like to do. Chariot's also surprisingly important against just control matchups, right? Or against dragons. It can be, if it resolves against control decks or dragons decks, or even blood money decks, it can just be a real problem for them to deal with. And also the combination of a Seeker's Chariot and Alrund's Epiphany is just chef's kiss. It's fantastic. Sometimes you even get to do stuff like play a Mascot Exhibition and then copy the tokens with the Chariot. And if you're playing a card like Mordenkainen, you can actually copy your dog illusion tokens with the Chariot as well. That's come up for me in some games because I do run Mordenkainen. So in the end, I think a Seeker's Chariot is doing enough for us, and it just solves some of the weaknesses of the deck. We can sometimes get overrun on turn 4 or 5 by creature decks, this really slows creature decks down. And then against controlling decks, it provides a single threat that can take over the board. If your opponent leaves off removal, you just attack with your cats, right? And then they're in this awkward position where they don't really want to point their removal at your cats. So anyway, it just this fills in a lot of the gaps in the deck. I think that it's really crucial. When people talk about not running this card, I don't really understand why. It's just a very good Magic card, right? And with a deck that's rushing to get to 4 mana, I just think it's an obvious choice. So yeah, I've been very happy playing 2 of those in my deck. Mordenkainen is a flex card. Honestly, I just played it in my list as a one-of to diversify my threats. It can put creatures on the board against creature matchups. It can be especially good against mono green. Like making a big creature can be really important against mono green to kind of brickwall them. And then in matchups where you need the card advantage, it draws you cards, right? So one of the best things that you can do with Mordenkainen is if you play it in the mid to late game, it helps you dig into your Alrund's Epiphany, which is usually how you close the game. So I think that Mordenkainen's great. It's also just another way, like even if your opponent does have a Vanishing Verse that they hit it, you still got to draw 2 cards, right? It's not a good deal for them. So yeah, I think that anyway, I like running 1, and it's also just another thing to do on 6. Sometimes you need to make an impactful play before you have 7 mana. So I like Mordenkainen a lot. Run 1 of those. Ashaya, of course, is a great combo with the Cyclone Summoner. This basically allows you to keep your creatures on the board while bouncing your opponent's creatures, and that is usually game over in any creature matchup. Another underrated aspect of Ashaya is that it turns your dorks into they tap for mana, right? So a nice play pattern is you play a Prosperous Innkeeper, you use the mana to ramp out an Ashaya, now you can tap the Innkeeper to make mana. It can even turn your spare Neverwinter Dryads into mana that you can use like now, right? Or use a lot sooner. You don't have to spend the mana. You can just get the value out of them. So sometimes Ashaya is actually an important part of our ramp plan. And then, of course, it just becomes a massive creature that can take over the game. And it dodges a lot of the removal in the format. So, yeah, Ashaya is really great. Finally, some people have chosen to run Inscription of Insight. I can see why. It's kind of a cool card because it gives you something to do on 4 as well as on 8. And so it's very flexible, but unfortunately I have just found that it doesn't actually advance our ramp plan on 4, which is what I want to be focusing on. It's not enough of a threat like a Seeker's Chariot, and it's also like against decks like mono white, bouncing 2 creatures to your opponent's hand is often not very good. Their creatures are really cheap, they just replay them next turn, and it really doesn't catch you up that much. And then when you hit this on 8, like it's fine, but it's not, it's not like a game changer in my experience. So I've just found overall Inscription of Insight to be a little underwhelming. Can be a good card, but a little underwhelming. So there you have it. That's my overview of just most of the cards that you might want to run in this archetype. These are the cards I'd be considering if I was going to build this deck. I basically wouldn't look outside of this pool of cards in putting my deck together. So let's talk about my build of the deck and what I came to. So again, let's just kind of go through it. Again, I found that Neverwinter Dryad and Prosperous Innkeeper were the 2 ramp creatures that were cheap, which dodge removal the best, the most reliably. And so that's why I choose to run these in the slot. I also don't want to run too much cheap ramp because then you just, like when you have 12 2-mana dorks, you can get really easily dork flooded, and I just don't think that we need it. Let's talk about Decisive Denial. Again, I think that this just solves a lot of problems for the deck. It gives us hard removal when we need hard removal. It gives us a counterspell when we need a counterspell. I think playing either of those separately in the deck, like playing a Frostbite or playing Negate, right, which I've seen some people play in these archetypes, or even saw it coming, I think is a terrible idea, right? Because our game plan, we're ultimately a tap-out deck. We only leave up mana when we didn't have something important to do that turn, or when it's later in the game. And so I think that it can be really disastrous to draw dedicated counter spells in the early game. So this is a versatile enough card that I think that it just does a lot for us. 4 copies of Divide by 0, like I said, I think this card's really important. Glassball Mimic is one of the funnest cards in the list, and it's really excellent in the deck. So copying a Cultivator for 3 mana and then getting another mana, it's basically like you spent 2 mana to get another Cultivator, which is just amazing, right? And then, of course, being able to copy a Cyclone Summoner for 3 mana and make another one and not bounce your original one is really, really cool. A further cool thing that you can do is if you copy a Cultivator in the early game with your Glassball Mimic and then you bounce it back to your hand in the late game with a Summoner, you actually get the Mimic back, and now you can actually copy a Summoner for like a much more impactful copy. So it's a really nice little synergy there. Also, it's just another land, right? So it gives us more lands to play. A Seeker's Chariot, like I said, I think this solves a lot of problems with the deck, just like Decisive Denial. I wouldn't play less than 2. I think a lot of people view this as a flex slot, and that's fine if you don't want to run the Chariot. Maybe you just play some Vastwood Surges and then make sure that you're running your full complement of the top end. I think that's totally fine. Again, Eureka Moment, a lot of people don't like this card. I do. I think it gives us something impactful to do in the late game, and I think it's following our ramp plan, and it's good enough in the early game, in my opinion, that I think it's fine. Quandrix Cultivator is just absolute house in the deck. Don't run less than 4, in my opinion. Ashaya, like I said, it's good. And then, this is my preferred split. I just think that the 4, 3, and 2 on the top end has worked out really well for me. I find that if I need one of these, I have ways to dig for them in the sideboard. I don't want to draw too many of these, especially like drawing a bunch of comas can be really bad. Sometimes you play a coma and you just need anything else to kind of close the game. And so drawing multiple comas in that situation is just not very good. And then this is the mana base that I've chosen. It's 26 lands, 2 Faceless Havens, like I said. So you'll notice that I'm not running as many Snowlands as a lot of people run. I'm actually only running 13 Snowlands apart from the Faceless Haven. But again, I view the Faceless Haven as more of a bonus in the deck. I'm not like focusing on activating it. I'm just treating that as gravy in the mid to late game. So, and then I run 1 layer of the Hydra. So basically, this is 5 creature lands I'm running here. The creature lands are really important in this format, so you want to make sure that you've got a critical mass of them in the deck. Okay, so that's my build. This deck has withstood the test of time. It's done very well. This version is currently 68% on the ladder win rate, and it's just been very, very solid for me. So really good deck. Let's take a look at another build of this. So Ali Aintrazi built this version of the deck, which I really took a lot of issue with, and I want to just talk about why that is. For starters, he's playing the 3 worst mana dorks, in my opinion. And there is some synergy here, so he's getting this synergy between Lotus Cobra and Emergent Sequence. There's also a synergy between Lotus Cobra and Vastwood Surge. I'm guessing that he's using that spare mana to cast the Glimpse of the Cosmos, so I think that's kind of how he's worked out his list here. I tried this deck and I found it to be really inconsistent. He's also only running 21 lands, which I just think is nonsense. Like I said before, you actually do want to draw lands so that you can play them from your hand. So there's just no way. I had a game with this deck where I played 2 Glimpses of the Cosmos in 1 turn and hit 6 non-lands. And I died because I was digging for a land, right? That's the kind of thing that happens when you run a 21 land deck. So I just think that I just don't get it. I literally don't get why you would do that. It just seems like you're relying so heavily on your mana dorks to live and to actually get it done for you. And I think with a deck like this, you're going to end up frequently disappointed. Vastwood Surge does help to make up for a little bit, and as you can see, he's running his full complement here. He's also running Gravenlore, which I think is kind of cool. This is a card I would love to add to my deck, but I just couldn't find the room for it, so I haven't really played it yet. But it's a powerful draw spell, and when you're ramping, it really helps to solve some of your card advantage issues. So, yeah, I ultimately didn't like this deck very much, but it's definitely another option. You can try it out. And then Covertgoblue's build, I actually haven't downloaded it for you here, but what Covertgoblue's basically chose to do is just to cut out a lot of the mid game of the deck and just play a bunch of ramp on this side, a bunch of payoffs on this side. I think that he does like the field trip, and that's basically been his approach to playing the deck when I've seen him do it. And he gets totally fine results with it. He likes it. A lot of his audience like it. So that's kind of a midway, right? You can pick something which is kind of between Ali's list and my list, and you'll probably get a good result. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. As you can see, I'm losing my voice a little bit. I think that this archetype Simic ramp is tier 1 in this format, and I think that there are many ways to build it. It's one of the things that makes it exciting. I like my version the best with my thought process, but I'm not laboring under the illusion that this is the ultimate build. I think that you can still work with it. I think there are a lot of cool options, and I think that there is some ultimate build of this deck which will be tier 1 in this format, and maybe even tier 1 after rotation. So if you enjoy this kind of deck and you already have a lot of these cards, just try it out. I think it's really great.